Hi, everyone. I'm Alice Merryweather. I am an Athletes for Hope whole being athlete ambassador. I'm a retired alpine skier, a 2018 Olympian, and I experienced an eating disorder during my career. And so I'm excited to be on this panel today talking to everybody.
Dr. Allen, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Dr. Mark Allen. I'm a child and adolescent and adult psychiatrist with a special interest in eating disorders and sport. I live here in Denver, Colorado, and um, had the opportunity to work with Alice in the past doing stuff like this. I'm really happy to be on the panel. Thank you.
Hi, y'all. I'm Allie Don Sing. I'm a therapist in the Denver area as well that specializes in sports psychology and eating disorders. And so, really happy to get to chat with y'all today. Where do y'all think we should start off today in terms of just providing some education on athletes and eating disorders, since unfortunately it's not talked about enough in the culture?
I mean, I think from the athlete experience side of things, the lack of education that's out there, I see it improving every year, it seems like, but especially when I was a teenager and I was competing kind of in the earlier development stages of my ski career, there was no sort of education on what an eating disorder was, what signs could be that something wasn't right with myself or with any of my teammates. And even within my own sport of alpine skiing, we call it a gravity sport. And so eating disorders were even further from the forefront of what anyone talked about or anything that we thought could arise with athletes. And so when I was diagnosed with my eating disorder, I was really caught off guard because I just didn't know anything. I hadn't understood the patterns that I was displaying, and I hadn't realized that that was something that could happen to me.
Yeah, I think
Well, I was
unfortunately a
going
lot of athletes would relate to that.
well, I was going to start off with a trivia question because I like trivia questions. What five sports have the highest prevalence rate of developing eating disorders? And I actually want real names. And so this would typically would be when the audience would be like, "Yeah, wave your hand." And I'm not going to ask the two of you, but so the answer is dot 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 rowing, which is a weight class based sport, gymnastics and figure skating, both more like appearance or aesthetic based sports, and then cross country and cycling, which low body mass advantageous sports. So those are the five, and there's reasons behind that. So there's kind of like three primary sort of areas that lead to that higher prevalence rate, which at some point I can get into, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Dr. Allen, I think you bring up a good point there of those risk factors. And then, like Alice, like you were saying, maybe your sport, they hadn't totally identified it as you facing some of those risk factors. And I'm curious, in retrospect, what do you wish your younger self had had access to or insight to help you maybe catch that before it escalated?
I wish I had had more education on mental health in general. I mean, even back to sixth grade health class, I think that was when I first learned what an eating disorder was. But what I learned was, oh, that's just something that teenage girls do to themselves, to be skinny. And so I didn't understand that it's actually like has serious mental health implications, that it's not a choice, that it's so much deeper than just based on aesthetics or based on performance, that it affects so many levels. And so I think I wish that that education, that very first intro to eating disorders had been different. But then also as I became more and more involved in my sport, I think that there's a real lack of athlete eating disorder education, no matter what sport it is, even in my sport where eating disorders aren't super prevalent, just to understand that it's still possible, that it's something that can happen, and that taking care of your mental health is really important because it can trigger eating disorders or all kinds of other harmful behaviors if you let that mental health aspect lapse. And then, I mean, for me, I missed a season to recover and go to treatment. It's the same as an injury, and no athlete wants to be missing time that they could be competing. And so I think that that preventative step on the front end is something I really wish had existed early in my career.
Yeah, I think you really highlighted like the biopsychosocial we talk about with our athletes when we're telling them in treatment. And Dr. Allen, I wanted to invite you in if you wanted to explain what the biopsychosocial is of an athlete and some of those components Alice was talking to that we kind of overlook at times.
Yeah, well, the issue is you don't just like you don't can't just like see an eating disorder walking out in public. Really, unfortunately, they affect all cultures, genders, you name it. They're there, and some of the stats. It used to be like a 10-to-1 ratio. At least that was the believed ratio of females to males, but that's actually shrunk quite a bit as just we've been asking the questions. So, what is the biopsychosocial model? So you have biological factors that sort of predispose someone to developing disordered eating. There's psychological factors. They may have experienced something in their past, trauma. Trauma. Eating disorders are not about food per se; they're about control, and so it just happens to be a maladaptive way, or that for someone to actually address that control. And then there's social factors too, like a sports environment per se. Like sports don't cause eating disorders, but the sports environment can lend itself to being there can be toxic elements to it. I mean, there can be body comparison in locker rooms and stuff that just breeds like wildfire. So when you do a thorough assessment of someone, you're talking to them to figure out kind of what's going on with the disordered eating. You want to ask all those questions that include those elements.
Yeah, and even something in there I think highlighted well within the sport culture is those good athlete traits. And so there's these traits that, make athletes who they are and make them someone a coach wants to coach or that, wants to get recruited. So that would be something like perfectionism, dedication, hard work, really strong with their training or exercise plan. And I always highlight to my athletes that those traits are fabulous. And when taken too far, it can be their demise. And Alice, I saw you kind of laugh at that one. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, throughout my whole recovery process, I learned the phrase pretty early on of being a recovering perfectionist. And I still feel that way to this day. I mean, so many athletes have such high drive and so much perfectionism where everything they do has to be just right. And we're very good at routines. We're very good at committing ourselves to our tasks and to our goals. But like you said, taken too far, that becomes really restrictive, really controlling. And that put me into a really negative headspace because I was controlling what I was eating. I was controlling how much I was working out, thought that more was better, all of these patterns that that perfectionist voice in my head said, this is good, you're doing more, you're going above and beyond. Those were actually really harming me in the process.
Yeah, I think that's so important when athletes can recognize that because often, unfortunately, our culture will praise those things. So if someone's training outside of their training plan, going for an extra run, whatever, most people will be like, oh, look how dedicated she is. And yet what they're seeing right in front of them may be an eating disorder really struggling in front of their eyes.
Yeah.
Question for y'all in terms of what do you think are some of the factors, like we were just saying, those good athlete traits getting taken too far, that we could help people who maybe don't have as much education on eating disorders of some of those signs and symptoms to look out for in their loved ones or in their athletes to help get them to resources for disordered eating or eating disorders?
Mark, I'll let you take this one.
I mean, you already kind of nailed the perfectionism aspect. The dedication to training. The question is when is it going too far? And people do want to get ahead, and so then are they doing quote clean eating, and that leads to quote orthorexic traits, and then that can this be a slippery slope to then developing actually disordered eating patterns, and then are we abiding by the fuel in fuel out equation? So then we're talking about, are we developing relative energy deficiency in sport because of our input is not matching our output? I mean, there's so many athletes I've worked with who simply aren't fueling to that output, and they don't actually have an internal drive for thinness or or reporting any body image distress. Now, it might actually be there where they at a weight restore, and they now don't feel comfortable in their body, but because of that imbalance, that can lead to all these medical issues, and that's not even anorexia. That's a totally separate bear. I might be getting a little bit ahead of the conversation, but I do think it probably stems from that competitive nature, that desire for control that just goes out of hand.
Yeah, and I always try to recognize this in my athletes and have empathy of, control isn't per se bad. It's just what type of control are we trying to gain? And really, I feel for them when they feel like they need to grasp control. That tells me that there's the pain, the suffering, the confusion, whatever's going on. It's just really figuring out what adaptively can we control instead of becoming so hyper-focused on our food, our body, our training. And I think something I always like to highlight to them is factors of performance, that there's 30 to 40 plus factors that have actually been studied that impact an athlete's performance. And so really trying to invite them in and make them look at these charts and say, hey, where have we just totally overlooked these factors because we've become so hyper-focused on 1 to 3 factors right now?
Yeah, I'd say also along with the warning signs, for me personally, the people that were closest to me, I mean, my eating disorder really set in during the COVID-19 pandemic, and so many people developed mental health issues from that. It was sort of that loss of control where every single day the future seemed very uncertain and everyone was very isolated. And for me, that drove a need for control in some area of my life. And I had all this training, and I had all these athlete tendencies already, and training had to continue. So it very quickly spiraled. But what the people closest to me during that time saw was not necessarily a physical change or something super tangible, but I became way more irritable, and I didn't enjoy the things that had enjoyed before. I was way less social, like didn't want to be engaged with the world around me very much, and I just kind of recoiled, closed myself off, which, at the time didn't stand out as anything crazy, but looking back, right, those are clearly signs that I was not operating at my full mental capacity or physical capacity. And so I think one way that people, like coaches, family members, significant others, can keep an eye out if they think someone is at risk is, like, their behaviors over time, right? You know what their normal is. If you've known them for years, especially, like, how someone operates, and seeing drastic changes like that should raise red flags. And I'm lucky that it did in the people that were around me, and they did bring this up and they approached me about it. But when it's also on the flip side heralded as, oh, she's so dedicated right now, like she's really committed to working out a lot. And I think that's maybe something that also on the coaching side or on the family side, where there's just a lack of education in some cases, and they don't know that those are warning signs, and should be taken pretty seriously.
So I probably think it would be smart to talk about, like, what is an eating disorder? It's so very plain language. It's a psychological illness with physical sequelae. Happens to involve food intake and that kind of thing. But there's different categories. So the one that we're probably going to focus mostly on is anorexia, because it's the deadliest of all the eating disorders. Deadly psychological illness. That's in the restrictive sort of category. There's another style of restrictive eating disorder called ARFID, or avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. It's a mouthful. We love acronyms in mental health, but that's basically anorexia minus the cognitions. It's when someone's not able to get in enough. They either have they're either extremely low body weight or normal body weight, but have a nutritional deficiency. So a very common example of someone with ARFID would be a young person who has a very restricted food range and therefore has developed a vitamin imbalance, or someone has a vitamin A deficiency, has gone blind. That's an extreme example that unfortunately happens. But textural sensory issues, so that's there. as far as anorexia goes, that's when, that fuel in, fuel out equation is not matching, but they have a drive for thinness. They have body image distress. They might be expending calories in another way, like overexercise in our athletes. That's part and parcel with what their identity is. So exercise tends to be what they already enjoy. It also happens to be their main method of coping. So they like it, they cope with it, and it's problematic. And then they're also not fueling themselves. So that's where it really can get out of control. Anorexia can affect every body system. The most dangerous body system that affects is cardiac, just because that can lead to really serious stuff like cardiac arrhythmias and leading someone needing to be hospitalized. It also can affect things that are easier to point out, like gastrointestinal issues or slow down gut, because when you're not eating, your GI system doesn't learn how to move food along, and you have a feeling of fullness, and then you don't want to eat, and so it just spirals. The other category you have more like
Dr. Allen, before you jump to that, do you mind talking about low heart rate? Because I think that's so important within the sport context, because often that's really highly praised.
Yeah. Sorry, otherwise I'll just keep going.
I love the excitement. I appreciate
it. Yeah, low heart rate. Well, okay. Think about the Lance Armstrongs of the world, really, really, really talented folks who do a lot of cardio. They may have a lower resting heart rate at baseline. Okay, so typical resting heart rate between 60 to 100. 100 is on the high side. Past that, we call it tachycardia, rapid heart rate. Below 60 is, quote, bradycardia. When someone is not fueling themselves, their heart rate is going to get lower, and the lower the heart rate, the more dangerous we're talking about to potentially have a heart arrhythmia, and then leading to real issues that lead to medical hospitalization. But a lot of these athletes may be sitting at what would be typically bradycardia, or low heart rate for the general public, but it's a, quote, athletic heart. But that then with no nutrition, it starts to reach really, really concerning. It would not shock me. I mean, I've definitely in my career seen high 20s, low 30s heart rate, which for one of us, I would be not doing well. I would need to be hospitalized for that. But the electrolyte imbalances that can come with low intake, so a low potassium level that might come in from purging behavior, can also lead to arrhythmias. So low intake plus an electrolyte imbalance leads to badness. So that's the easiest way I can describe it.
Yeah, I just think there's a lot of confusion with the strong athlete heart versus a sick heart, because athletes, the competitiveness, once again, if their heart rate isn't low enough, then they perceive themselves to not be fit enough, and that their counterparts or their teammates are more fit than them. And yet sometimes some of these athletes are facing a sick heart.
Yeah, speaking from my own experience there, my whole team had Oura rings. So the sleep monitoring, they're not very good for athletics, but pretty accurate monitoring sleep. And so we would compare our sleep data all the time, and that can be fun. It can also foster a very weird comparison environment. And my heart rate tends to be very low especially during my eating disorder days. And I just thought I celebrated that. I was very proud of how low my heart rate was, because it must have meant that I was really fit and I was really healthy. And again, hindsight 2020, that was not a healthy spot for me to be at. And it kind of goes to show of how overanalyzing data sometimes, or getting too much data, especially these days. You have Strava, you've got heart rate monitors, you have Oura rings, Whoops, all of those things. They can be great. They can be really fun. Nice to have some of that data. There's also a fine line on the other side, where mixed with sort of these societal or athletic norms that are skewed and celebrated, like a low resting heart rate, that it can be easy for that data to become really negative and really overwhelming. And so I think that hits close to home for me, talking about the low heart rate, because I was really thrilled to have a low heart rate for a long time before I understood the science behind it.
So I think it's just so important for other athletes to hear that, so that they check in with their providers, to really check in of, is this quote unquote normal? Is this an athlete heart, or is this actually a sick heart going on? Because like you said, so often most people are just going to praise that.
Yeah.
Also, anorexia leads to, or depending on kind of where you are in your malnutrition, it leads to protein breakdown. That leads to a really weak heart. aside from the low heart rate, and then floppy valves, so that in an inefficient heart. So not only is it not pumping as well, the valve, anyway, all of this said, it stacks upon each other that can lead to a lot of cardiac issues. So the other categories, as we were kind of going along, you have then the compensatory behaviors for someone who has maybe a perceived binge. So binging behavior, anybody on this call or anybody watching this call will be someone eating an inordinate amount of food in one sitting. Some criteria for binge eating disorder, at least once every, is it 3 months or, don't quote me on the actual time frames here, but for when someone feels like they've overeaten, then they'll do something to sort of waste that calories, and so that's when overexercise comes in. That's where purging comes in, and making yourself throw up, using diuretics, laxatives. In our athletes, it tends to be with that overexercising and we can really overdoing it. And so those are sort of like the three categories. Now, you can put diagnostic labels on things. As practitioners, we do it so we can communicate among each other. But as far as the general public, just know that these are disordered eating behaviors and they're problematic.
Mm-hmm. And I think a really important one to bring up is those maladaptive exercise behaviors. So the three categories of excessive, compensatory, and compulsive. And Dr. Allen, I heard you really talking about those compensatory I hear so often my athletes say, if I'm going to eat X, Y, and Z, then I have to go for a run after. Or the compulsive, you'll hear, because it's more of that mood management or just experiences, and say, well, I'm so anxious, the only thing that can bring me down is a run. And something I see on social media, and I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts, is, exercise or the gym is my therapy. And once again, like Alice was saying earlier, like all these things can be great, and there's a certain point where it's actually problematic.
I mean, I think the conversation of deserving food or earning food, I mean, it's at every level of our society. I mean, I remember even in high school, like doing a heavy Friday workout, and it was earn your weekend, right? If it's someone's birthday, you do an extra big workout for their birthday, and then it's like, now you can go eat cake. And it's like, well, no, that's implying that because I've worked harder, I deserve different food, or that feeling. I mean, that just, even from a young age, that then links delicious food with needing to work out harder. And that is something that I see on social media so much of like earning, deserving. I went on this long run, so now I, get to go eat X or drink X. And it's just, I remember the first time someone told me that everyone deserves food. And I like the fact that I stopped and had to actually think about that, because I had convinced myself otherwise so much, especially as an athlete, of like, well, I need to be perfect, so I don't deserve anything, right? It's like, that's so far from the truth. And I think that's a really, really harmful conversation that society has and social media really propels.
Yeah, Alice, I'll add on to that. Like growing up, even at not even high levels of competition, how many times did a coach say, if you guys win tonight, I'll take you out to get ice cream? And so it felt like only if I win or perform well do I deserve and then get the ice cream. And so actually, I'll take your deserve one step further and say, I tell everyone that every human needs food. And so I don't care how bad of a human you think someone is or what you've done. Even people on death row, we feed them. And I'm not saying those people are horrible people. From a therapist perspective, I can see where a lot of behaviors and things come from, but I really try to give that perspective of, I always ask, if you were in front of a younger child right now, if there were two children in the room, would you look at one child and say, hey, you deserve food, so I'm going to feed you, but you over here, you've been bad today, you've annoyed me, I'm not going to feed you? And most people are horrified by that question of like, I would never do that. And yet I say, well, that's what you're doing to yourself right now.
Yeah. I think that's also such a good tool of sort of externalizing what we would say to other people, right? And learning how to then show that kind of compassion to ourselves. That was something that I relied on quite a bit during my recovery of, going to treatment. The things that I was saying to myself about my body and about what I was doing, like it was extremely negative and self-deprecating. And then I'd turn to my peers at treatment and be so supportive and be their cheerleaders. It took a lot of time to realize like I need to be able to say all those things to myself and I need to mean it. I I have to start internalizing that, and it took a ton of practice to be able to do it and not feel ridiculous. It made me feel, complacent, or am I not, I can't be treating myself this kindly. Like then I'm not trying to be better if I'm doing that. But that's just not the case,
Well,
right?
there's that control aspect in there of like, I have to be the exception to the rule, because if I'm the exception to the rule, then I'm in control of becoming this great athlete or this great performer.
Exactly. Yeah. Once I learned how to show myself that compassion, then I had the space to work on other things, and I could actually, train more effectively or interact with other people around me in a much nicer, kinder, more open way because I had the bandwidth for it. I wasn't just constantly sparring with myself in my mind.
Any tips for anyone struggling in this way of how did you start to build that compassion? Because I think that's one of the things I notice the most with my patients and clients is, they could say, I would never say that to anyone else, but, I can't believe it for myself.
I think something.
Honestly, it took
Yeah.
so much repetition for at least coming from my end. It was just every single time, like being super aware of everything that I was saying to myself, the way that I was talking to myself, even today, I'm several years out of treatment, and it still I can catch that voice when I start to turn really negative on myself. And the moment I start to do that, I try to stop, take a step back, and think like, would I say that to someone else? What would I say to someone that I knew was thinking about themselves in the way that I just did? And try to kind of reset it that way of giving myself a little bit of space, a little bit of like go third person on myself almost.
Mm-hmm.
But it just took a lot of practice.
Yeah, a lot of reps.
Well, going third person, that's like one of the primary modes of treating disordered eating, or when you're trying to connect with a patient as a practitioner, is to externalize the eating disorder from the person. Because I can assure you, I mean, Alice, you can speak from personal experience, but the person themselves has way better things to do with their life than to think about food and nutrition and exercise and stuff 99% of the day. I mean, they have life goals and things to do. And so, but it's that unwanted guest in their house, the eating disorder, that is really causing all the problems. And so we need to band together with the person to address the eating disorder. As that same with if I was treating a child, we would want the family to rally around the kid who does not want the eating disorder. It might come out with venom at the meal at the table, but that's the eating disorder. So it's like I absolve the family of all the guilt they may be feeling about the why. Like the why is unimportant about how the eating disorder actually developed. That's the stuff you do after someone's weight restored, and you can do retrospective work. But in the here and now, like actually to help to someone, it's like it's all hands on deck, right? We want to help get that weight restoration going, no matter however we need to be doing it, and then start to introduce healthier methods of coping. Because when you take away an eating disorder, guess what? That's a maladaptive coping strategy that unfortunately has worked to a degree, and managing some of that stress. And they may not actually have any other tools in their toolbox to do it. So as a practitioner, you got to like talk about other ways that can be helpful dealing with stress, like mindfulness activities. So that's like hugely important. I don't know if either of you guys want to speak to that.
I would just piggyback on that. I mean, the externalizing, when it was still like too hard for me to do that, because early on in treatment that can be so difficult. And so I struggled separating myself from my eating disorder. And that was a way that my boyfriend was actually really helpful as a support, where I would say something and he would say, I mean, we just named the eating disorder Ed, ED. And he said, is that Ed talking or is that Alice? And that was just a really like simple, it was not confrontational. It was just a way to take a step back and be like, oh, that was Ed, that wasn't Alice. And so that kind of support that, isn't it's not an intervention. It was just a question of like, am I talking to Alice or am I talking to Ed? It really would make me think, and it was super helpful.
Yeah, I think that is so important to recognize where the value is coming from, because the eating disorder values a certain body shape and size. The eating disorder values a certain amount of nutritional intake. But what does someone like Alice actually value? And Alice, I'm curious if you're willing to share like what values did help you start to pursue recovery.
Yeah, I did a big values exercise, which was super helpful, and I settled on some that kind of sound interesting, but growth, beauty, actually, of the inner sort, not of the external sort, compassion, uh, gratitude. I think those were the main ones. And like actually going through this exercise, and you start with 100 plus value cards, I think it is, and you eliminate through rounds and rounds and rounds, and eventually having those like 4 or 5 values that I could turn to, like I had them written on everything, so that when I found myself speaking very negatively to myself or needed to go externalize the eating disorder, I could think back to like, is what I'm thinking right now working towards growth, beauty, gratitude, compassion, or is this Ed's values? And so it's very grounding. It was really helpful to actually like figure out what those key core values were for me, because it did make that distinguishing, or made it easier to distinguish between my own, what Alice wanted and what Ed wanted.
And I know we're running a little tight on time, so just wanting to give that heads up as we wrap this up. Are there any points we really want to hit home, or just insight we want to give everyone watching this?
I'd say one more important aspect in the sports world, specifically with eating disorders, is how frequently athlete bodies are talked about, both like from coaches, even from parents. If you're watching the Olympics with your family, right? It's easy for a parent or a sibling to point to an athlete on the screen and make a comment about an athlete's body shape, size. I think all of those conversations are harmful, even if it's to say like, oh my God, that athlete, has a crazy six pack, or like, wow, look how strong they are, look how tall they are. It just sets a standard, especially to young athletes who are watching and hearing this, that they think, well, okay, if I want to do that, I need to look like that, right? Because that's being celebrated. And if it's negative, then it starts a whole thing of like, oh my God, do I look like that? Like, how do I make sure I don't look like that? I don't want people saying those things about me. And I think that even in the home or in the kind of coaching environment, if you're watching other athletes and having those kinds of conversations, I think they're super detrimental. And then very similarly, commentators oftentimes comment on athletes' bodies. They compare athletes to one another. And what I would love to see change is that conversation just shifts to performance, to what the athletes are actually doing. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what an athlete looks like when they're doing their sport or what their body looks like. It's all about if they win, if they lose, if they're the fastest, the strongest. And it really doesn't matter what their shape and size is when they do it. So I think I would encourage anyone who's listening to this panel or has been in a situation where someone has made a body comment about another athlete or compared athlete bodies to just call that out and say, but look how well they're performing, or just to kind of reassert that it's not about what an athlete looks like at all. And hopefully we can kind of chip away at that body image narrative that is rampant in the sports world.
I love that you share that. I couldn't have stated or shared it any better. I just echo that.
Along with that, the body image stuff, and specifically with weight-based sports, one of the things I really want to kind of hammer home is we don't want to fit a square peg in a round hole related to weight classes. So if someone, like, the concept of cutting weight is horrible. If someone's body phenotype doesn't match the weight class they're trying to compete in, they just need to simply go to the weight class that it does, versus trying to fit into this ideal, which is not even ideal. It's not ideal. So that's just simply unsafe. So then the practices that are used to cut weight are really, really dangerous, especially from a cardiac angle. Another thing to talk about too is related to just how language is really important. And I feel like with communicating about eating disorders, you can view them as sort of the tendinitis of physical injuries. That if, like, it's not dealt with, it's like a lingering injury. If it's not dealt with, it just will fester and get worse. So really, you do need to talk to a professional to get them help. And then the question is, like, how do you actually get them help? Well, anybody that works around the athlete can sort of raise a hand, take the athlete to the side, and just say how they're doing, just, open into conversation. But as far as the actual workflow, athletic trainers tend to have the closest relationships with athletes, especially on the team. They're the eyes and ears of the facility. Could then talk to the team physician or the team psychologist or whomever, and then it can go down the chain. There's different evidence-based tools to screen for eating disorders, but we all kind of work together as a team. And then the whole return to play protocol actually involves all those team members I just mentioned, that they should actually all be in agreement that XYZ criteria have been met with their weight restoration goals, with their nutrition, that hopefully the team nutritionist or dietitian's weighed in on that, and that then they're ready to go. During that recovery process, just something that hasn't really been talked about much until recently, there's a wonderful website called safeexerciseateverystage.org, which I see Allie immediately nodding her head. But it talks about how incorporating healthy movement into recovery can be useful, assuming the athlete is ready. And so, because if you do complete abstinence of movement, that actually leads to poor outcomes long-term or prognosis. That does not mean that someone who's in the throes of their eating disorder and is trying to recover needs to go right back to the field. No, not suggesting that. But it might be that based on their cardiac status that they're allowed to go on walks. And there's actually a step-by-step approach that shows them where, based on X criteria, they're allowed to do this. And it can be a little bit of a carrot approach, sorry to use a food pun, on that recovery. So anyway, that was really the last parts I needed to get in.
I love that you shared that resource, Dr. Allen, and I know we'll be sending over some more resources with athletes and eating disorders over to Athletes for Hope. So hopefully everyone can just have access to those.